Hello, I'm Matthew Gwyther, and welcome to this Jericho Chambers Echo podcast in the series What After Woke. Now, we've got a real treat for you this time. We have the godmother of sustainability in the UK interviewed by me. Sue Garrard was the person who invented Unilever as the most sustainable brand in the country. And she was there for a number of years, and she invented the Sustainable Living Plan 2010 to 2020. She was brought up by Salvation Army parents and grandparents who she said put the right microchip into me. And she certainly went about it with a vigor with Paul Polman, who you remember was the CEO of Unilever during those years. And when I interviewed her about 3 or 4 years ago, she said something very interesting to me. She said, I've met many bosses over the years, and most actually really want to do the right thing. They feel they haven't spent 35 years getting to the top of the greasy pole just to deliver quarterly profit targets, which they live or die by, and have their kids feel awkward about what their parent is doing at the office. But doing something is really tough, and it was always tough at Unilever. It's a painful, iterative journey. There's no first mover advantage in purpose on sustainability. But the problem now, of course, is that everything has gone into reverse after Trump, and people involved directly in sustainability are diving for the trenches. So, where now is the whole ESG sustainability argument? And Sue has some very interesting answers to those questions. So, watch the interview, it's fascinating. Sue, good morning. It's lovely to speak to you again. But these are troubled times, aren't they, for somebody like you? Just take us through what's happened since Trump arrived in January of this year. Has it turned your world upside down?
I'd like to find a tiny stone somewhere in the world that hasn't been turned upside down by his arrival. But yes, it's colossal in the field of sustainability. And of course, it's colossal in the field of business more generally. And increasingly, that was the direction that the two were going in, which is that they were becoming the same thing at some level, sustainability and business, I mean. And of course, what he's doing in a largely unhelpful way, but not entirely, come on to that if you like, is he's really throwing a spotlight on the sustainability element of business. So it's, as you say, troubled and challenging times.
But do you feel at the moment as that 25 years of your work, your hard effort is being undone and reversed?
Partially, but um, I still see some very strong trends of change. So I think there's partly a kind of to steal a phrase from our former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, and now running Canada. You know, there's really a question around time horizons here, and there are some things which have already been baked in to personal economies, businesses, and national economies that are not going to be undone. And there are some trends, macro trends that you see, which have taken 25 years to get here, that are also not going to be turned around. But there are scores and scores of people putting the ranges really from putting their head down to rowing back because the timing doesn't feel right anymore. And because this stuff is hard, it's probably some of the hardest change for businesses to go through.
So I think it's fair to say that Unilever was a poster child for the sustainability movement, wasn't it? And that had many effects. You garnered a lot of attention. It was said on the university milk rounds consistently over the years that you were getting the creme de la creme of graduates. You know, the really smart young people wanted to come and work for Unilever because they believed in that vision. Oh, let me ask you two questions. What do you think's going on inside Unilever at the moment? You're no longer working there, but also, what do you think those young people who were recruited into the organization for those very reasons, that value set, what do you think they're feeling at the moment?
Well, you're right, we were a poster child. And uh, the then head of the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, which was set up by the then Prince of Wales 30 years ago. What a vision that man had and still has, although he has to be more cautious around it now. We did a lot of work with them at Unilever, and she said to us, if Unilever loses its way on this agenda, it won't just put Unilever back, it will put the whole corporate agenda back by a decade, because you're starting to generate followership. And there's no point in being a leader if others don't follow. If you're out there on your own, the scale of the shifts that have to happen, sectoral and market shifts, are so big that no one company can make that happen on their own. And we had been doing quietly some very significant things for 2 decades, up to the point where some of the more recent, volatilities around the leadership and what Unilever stands for came along. But when you dig beneath the surface and you look at the long-term commitments Unilever has made, they're still there. They're still playing a very dominant role in the key organizations where you're trying to get collective action from major businesses. So it's a picture that looks a bit more depressing superficially than when you dig into the detail. But there is no doubt that a combination of having Mr. Peltz on the board, some attacks by another major shareholder called Terry Smith, and a bit of a revolving door of CEOs in the last 5 years, and just colossal pressure to deliver the dividends, quarter in and quarter out, has had an impact. And I think that's inevitable, really.
Now, when I interviewed you 5 years ago, you said this: I've met many bosses over the years, and most actually want to do the right thing. They feel they haven't spent 35 years getting to the top of the greasy pole just to deliver quarterly profit targets, which they live or die by, and have their kids feel awkward about what their parent is doing in the office. The trouble is a massive gap that exists between intent and activism. Doing something is really tough, and it was always tough at Unilever. It's a painful, iterative journey. But it seems to me that that's now got even more painful. But how is that iteration occurring at the moment? Because I know you feel that there is much going on below the radar now, but perhaps people are just keeping quieter about it.
Yeah. Well, I think there's quite a big distinction now between sectors, would be one key point I would make. So if you're in the energy sector, you've got, I mean, just one example, which was in the FT, I think yesterday, is that even Trump has already U-turned on trying to block a $5 billion investment to onshore a massive wind farm in New York. And actually, when you look at what's going on and you read the Business Green and the key titles that are keeping you in touch with what's actually happening in key marketplaces, there are now, I would say, irreversible shifts happening in the energy market. Another headline just from yesterday was talking about how China is pushing hard now to be not only completely independent in energy, but is to accelerate on all its targets for low carbon energy. And of course, they've got the clout and the control to do it. And there's a very good geopolitical reason for that, which is that it makes them even more independent from countries like the US, and we've seen the way global tensions have risen. So none of this is altruism, but this is about recognizing that actually, in the end, one way or the other, we will get to net zero. The question is, will mankind do it themselves, or will we carry on in pursuit of short-termism and find that there are so many shocks to the system that our current system collapses?
You've got experience of government. You work in very senior positions in the civil service. And one of the other things that you said to me when we spoke 5 years ago, the irony remains, I consistently detect that business is far more up for the sustainability fight than government. And I wonder if that's actually still the same thing going on, because governments have to kiss the Trumpian ring, don't they? They have to go up and suck up to him. But business can do a fair bit still behind the scenes and do it quietly, can't it?
Well, I'll give you my ranking of who cares most and where the action's happening on this. And every single poll you see, I saw another one from Business Green just a couple of days ago, that it's actually the great British public. I'm being domestic for a moment here, but we can talk globally as well if you want. Here in the UK, you've still got nearly 2/3 of all voters, including Conservative voters, who are supportive of the existing net zero target, which, of course, ironically was introduced by Theresa May. I think one of the really good things that she did. You've also got 66% of all businesses saying that they know now that man-made climate change is a relatively imminent, not a long-term distant, and again, back to this time horizon point I made earlier, a fairly imminent threat to their business. The problem is that there's still a say-do gap, that they intellectually they recognise that, but it's very hard for them to decide what the right mitigation is and build the business case and build the capability and find the money. And then you have government who, I have to say, Keir Starmer in the run-up to the election, I know through various routes, was doing a lot of work, obviously supported by Ed Miliband, to really understand where the big levers might exist that would drive a shift to a low carbon economy and a low impact economy in terms of ecology, be it an economic driver, a creator of jobs driver, and build long term political popularity. And of course, they need all three. And if you look at the policies that he talked about and then introduced, they were actually very in line with that. There's had to be rowing back how much we can trust the 22 billion black hole that Rachel Reeves still talks about incessantly. I don't know, I'm not on the inside. I'm sure the finances were pretty horrific when they got in there. But there is no doubt also that there's a war of attrition being waged on the current level of domestic political commitment. And I think that's partly the realpolitik. But I also read a fascinating statistic just this morning that said that in the first 4 months of this year, there had been more inaccurate but negative critical commentary on Ed Miliband and his policies from January to April this year than in the whole of 2024. So, the media is enjoying, obviously, taunting Her Majesty's government, but this is an area of focus, and in a way that I think is unhelpful. Bad at best, it's badly informed journalism. In a lot of cases, it's very cynical and knowingly inaccurate journalism.
One of the other things I think that is definitely happening is that people like you wanted to take the whole sustainability argument away from comms, PR people within organisations, because you quite justifiably felt that it's got to do with more than simple communication and reputation. It's got to be, in the fibre of an organisation. You really know people. You need to have people who know what they're talking about. I get the sense it's going in the other direction now, and there are a lot of people within senior positions in comms in corporates who are quite worried that it's come back and fallen into their lap as their responsibility, this area, and they don't know what to do. So what advice would you have for them at the moment?
Well, I think it starts with one central thing, which I bang on about all the time. So I'm sorry, Matthew, if your eyes are going to glaze at this point. But it all starts with the business case. And that has to be owned by whoever runs business strategy. Communications, I've always said, need to be involved at the start of the development of anything key in business, because thinking about how it shows up is pretty critical. And historically, comms people were always complaining that they were brought in the last money and told they had to stick lipstick on a pig. But for anybody in comms who feels that they're stuck in exactly that position over sustainability, I think my advice is don't think about the external communication of this as your priority. Think about really speaking truth to power and interrogating until it gives up its secrets what the benefits of any sustainability activity are to the business, to the consumers, to the shareholders, to the planet. So, that's kind of a version of the now very old John Elkington triple bottom line approach. But the reality is, unless there's a credible, coherent story there with data, this can't just be assertion. There has to be data, evidence that backs it up. Then you're in a very vulnerable position as a communications person, trying to say anything positive in today's febrile environment. And so your job is to reflect that advice back into the senior leaders of the business. It's absolutely not to think about how you do the spin. So this is one of those topics where both immediately and I suspect for the medium term, the most seen, I'm talking here about the leaders of the communications function, really have to have a very strong backbone and see that their job is to protect the business, not the individual CEO who happens to be leading it at the moment, who might want you to make it sound like the pig is indeed wearing some lipstick. That is the wrong set of priorities.
Now let's get down into the weeds of purpose, Hellman's mayonnaise, and Terry Smith. I remember, looking at that from the outside and thinking this is almost degenerating to the level of comedy, to farce, where you had this dialogue going on about Terry saying, "Well, this is absolutely ridiculous. How can a mayonnaise have purpose, or what have you?" And I remember thinking, well, hang on a minute. When I was a kid, and we were encouraged to sort of not waste the vegetables, and my mother made bubble and squeak, you get a dollop of mayonnaise on the top, and there was actually kind of good sense behind something like that. You were lucky; you had a brand there, which was a pretty good brand, and you could say, well, listen, you can use it perhaps as part of the movement not to waste so much food. But how do you think why did it sort of degenerate to that level of apparently absurdity? How can something like that, a mayonnaise, have purpose? What happened there?
Well, I think Terry Smith's comments were particularly unfortunate because, as one of the major shareholders, what he proved was that a shareholder doesn't really understand the business in which it owns shares, irrespective of the size of the shareholding. And you will have seen lots and lots of stuff about this thing called the agency theory, which was how shareholding was founded, was that you deeply understood the business and acted in its best interests. And then you end up in the Terry Smith world, where again all he's really interested in is short-term delivery of a bottom line and an outcome to him. So if he had looked for a nanosecond at the performance of the key brands, of which there are 20 at Unilever, so it's a classic Pareto applies operation, he would have seen that Hellman's mayonnaise was actually, as a very long-standing brand, a decades-old brand, the kind of brand you would expect to be getting dusty on shelves because you can buy the same stuff for half the price in some supermarkets, was actually one of the fastest growing brands in the portfolio. So am I saying that that's because they were helping mums think about how they made food go further in a cost of living crisis? Of course, it's not as simple as that. But was it down to some massive promotion? No, because it was a medium term trend with the brand, not a short term trend. And so clearly, brands survive by existing in the minds of people beyond the rational product delivery and experience that using that product gives you. That's the whole point of a brand. And what the team were doing with that brand at that time was growing it ahead of the rest of the market, which is exactly what Terry Smith needs Unilever to be doing with its portfolio of brands. So I think there was a point where it just, for a long time, and I think a lot of this had to do with Pullman and his aura. People were very diffident about attacking Unilever, and certainly when I was there, I knew that people were anxious about saying anything because Paul didn't play by the normal CEO rules. When Paul went, it slightly reverted, unsurprisingly, to a bit more of a business as usual, in the sense that you didn't have a big rock star CEO that people were intimidated by, because they were definitely intimidated by Paul. And that combined with the unfortunate bid for GSK and movement on the board meant that people thought, well, they're fair game now. And you may or may not remember that it was actually a shareholder revolt that finally led to Paul's demise at Unilever within a very short space of weeks. And I think that shifted the dial. And I don't think it will shift back. And that's fine. That's very, very healthy. But what Terry did was unhelpful because it was inaccurate, but it's infectious for other businesses and other brands. And so businesses that are thinking, well, I've got a portfolio of brands, everybody knows this brand inside out, but is there a fresh point of view for this brand to have that's actually a bit useful for the planet, a bit useful for consumers, and adds to the story of the brand without feeling like you're lecturing people about how they're supposed to behave? That I still think there's a lot of fertile territory there for brands in certain sectors, but I don't know, but I suspect quite a lot of them are going, oh, that makes me nervous. On the other hand, tell me if you want me to tell you a brief story or not.
Go on.
On the other hand, if I can give you the example of Primark, who I worked with for several years developing their approach to sustainability, you will know one of the massive issues with the fast fashion sector is that it's regarded virtually as throwaway fashion, with clothes worn, once or twice by young people, photographed on Instagram and then chucked away. And something like 1 in 4 garments literally not worn. So one of the things that we said was, clearly we have to find some way of tackling this issue of you being disposable fashion. We tested the products and found that actually the core of their portfolio is very durable. So I said to them, well, why don't we look at one of your pledges being about the durability of your clothes, making clothes that last longer, so the clothes that people love don't have to be thrown away after 2 or 3 goes. And to start with, they looked at me like I was slightly mad, because the inference from that was that people wouldn't have to buy as many clothes. But my instinct said, and was borne out by research, that actually when you tell people that, people who previously had said, oh, I'd never shop at Primark, start going and shopping at Primark. And not a small number of people, 35% of all shoppers across Europe, said that would make me reevaluate and start thinking about buying at Primark. And by the way, that's published data from the date back in 2021 when we launched the strategy. And now they're working hard on how they actually make sure individual lines of like massive sellers like jeans and t-shirts actually deliver that. And they're working with RAP, who are the people the government uses, to try and set high street standards, amongst other things, on recyclability. So it just shows you that you can still find really major long-term sweet spots between planetary benefit, business benefit, and consumer benefit. It's hard, but it's worth working for.
To go back to Unilever, what do you think the Lever brothers, the famous Victorian philanthropists, would have made of Trump? Because it strikes me that there is something quite Victorian about Trump. He's a bit of a throwback to another age in a way, isn't he? What would they have understood where he was coming from? Would they have been familiar with that sort of mentality?
I think their values were very deeply philanthropic. I think they felt the burden of privilege and were highly motivated to convert that into long-term benefit to help address social issues through business. So that's why you ended up with them building a whole town called Port Sunlight, giving people time off, enabling women to have maternity leave, helping people have a pension. This was absolutely groundbreaking stuff 140, 50 years ago. And it's why they said the mission for their first big brand was to make cleanliness commonplace, because they knew that basic hygiene was one of the biggest killers in the country, particularly infant mortality. So I think I think they would have been horrified at his very cynical view about the value of life, depending on which day of the week he woke up on and whether he thought the Mexicans were good for building car factories or needed to build a bigger wall.
So, how did you feel then when an organisation like Accenture was so rapidly out of the traps in February of this year, scrapping their global diversity, inclusion goals, sunsetting all those sorts of projects that they'd got going over the previous 10 years, and being led by a woman? You know, there was 800,000 people within that organisation, and suddenly they turn on a dime and move in the opposite direction. How do you think? What did you feel about that, and what did you think people with inside Accenture would have felt about that?
Well, I was appalled because I think it just showed the complete lack of moral leadership. And it's not just Accenture, is it? That's, I don't want to kind of just pick on them. And the whole point about leadership is that you have to stand up when times are hard. If there aren't difficult decisions to be made, who needs leaders, right? Um, and you have to stand for something as a business, I think, if you're going to attract and retain the best long term talent. I mean, you mentioned Unilever and young people earlier. When we were really doing a lot of very good work and being very public about it, there were regular global surveys done on most preferred employer, and Unilever globally came third only to Google and Apple. It's mind boggling. We sold soup and soap, as our old COO used to say. By contrast, you've already got a lot of the service industries really battling to attract and retain good talent. Again, without naming names, there was a very big law firm here in the UK that we work with through Blueprint who said we simply are being so challenged by the younger people in the organization about working for people that are causing climate breakdown and defending their right to do that, and we can't tolerate it anymore. And you have 1,200 people writing an open letter to the New York Times who are at McKinsey's saying we can't tolerate this, and lots of very public resignation. So I think there will no doubt have been some short term dips in performance and loss of good people, but the long term damage, they will be reaping that for a long time, a very long time. But I think there's a sector wide dilemma now because a lot of young people simply want to feel that the values of where they work and their own values chime at some level.
I think that's absolutely true, isn't it? And I suppose the other thing is that there must be a sense in the back of people's minds that he'll only be around for another 3.5 years. I mean, do you think there's a possibility that it could be just back to business as usual and this is a temporary blip, an aberration?
Well, I think it's a reset. And in some ways, there are unplanned and unexpected bonuses from resets. So I think if you're Orsted or if you're any one of a very very long list of organisations that were thinking about investing, you might pause, you might downscale. But as I said, I think there are some sectors where the macro shift has reached its tipping point. There are others where you need to wait for a shift in government again to give enough indicators about what the following 5 years are going to be to justify big infrastructure investment, for example. That's the area where it's very difficult. And if you look at one very concrete example of that, the electric vehicle market, you've got predictions that around the world, 25% of all vehicles sold this year will be EVs. In the UK, it's growing at 35% a year. So you look at an economy and say, where the hell are we going to get growth from? Well, it's over here, stupid. They're very powerful trains, but that only works if you can plug your car in and get some electricity. And we're already looking at very significant issues around tension between growth in some areas that demand electricity supply and the inability of the national grid, never mind to plan, but to invest. And that's we're in a relatively stable operating environment. So I think the volatility of this is going to be very big and very messy for a very long time. And Trump, in the massive sweep of things, is going to feel like the blink of an eye. It doesn't now, but it will do.
Would you buy a Tesla, Sue?
Seriously, if it was my only form of transport, I'd rather ride my horse everywhere. Now that's part of, you could have asked me that before that ridiculous man went on stage with a whatever it was,
Some sort of device.
chainsaw. um, and switching from having loathed Trump to, lapping up anything that Trump says, and the scale of hypocrisy. I also don't like the cars, but he has, to be fair to the guy, he kick-started a sector. Good, that's great. He's done his job. But I mean, I have an EV and I think they're marvelous. I'm not blind to some of the issues and the weaknesses, and they weigh a ton, so don't ever break down in one. But all change is messy, as I've said before, but never ever will you see me in a Tesla.
Sue, we'll leave it with that. Thank you very much for your time this morning.
My pleasure.
So Unilever really was the poster child of purpose, and Sue remains adamant that it works. It possessed, during her time there, 400 brands in total, but 40 of those brands created 80% of the total turnover. And by the time she left Unilever in Blackfriars, 26 of those 40 big hitting brands had been given the thorough sustainability treatment. And she says, and I have no reason to doubt her, that they were growing 67% faster than the rest of the portfolio. So her argument, Sue's argument, is ignore Trump, sustainability, ESG works. And I think the final question is, what's going to happen to Unilever's graduate intake over the next few years now? Having been that poster child where they had the creme de la creme after Apple and Google, are they still going to be able to attract those sorts of individuals who feel that they want to do something purposeful with their careers? Only time will tell. I'm Matthew Gwyther. Thanks for watching.